This is a brief explanation of the context of European exploration in the late 15th century. Europe was incredibly isolated during the Middle Ages. Feudalism, their system of governance, was a system that kept them isolated. They were self-sufficient, because of that, they were cut off from the Middle East, and they were cut off from the rest of Asia and even the rest of Africa. They weren't advancing technologically, they weren't advancing in terms of money and trade, they weren't advancing, even particularly advancing in terms of learning and academic work. So that isolation was really, really bad for them. Then there was a major wake-up in Europe that we call the Renaissance. They had interacted briefly with the Middle East through the Crusades, which was a series of wars to try to take the holy city of Jerusalem from the Muslims. Set aside the fact that they were going to war against the Muslims, they were opened up to all of the wealth and all of the wonderful objects from the rest of Asia that existed in the Middle East, and they wanted those objects. What those objects were silk and porcelain from China, spices from India, and objects from all over South, Central, and East Asia. Those were items that the average European could not afford, but other Europeans, including the nobles and the royalty, absolutely could afford, and they wanted it and were willing to pay high prices to get it. That meant that other people were able to go out and get those items, bring them back to Europe, and sell them for very high prices. This created a new class of merchants who were the facilitators of the trade. They didn't make the items, but they went and got the items and then sold them for marked up prices. Italy led the charge. They had some very important cities like Genoa and Venice, which were on the coast and had easy access to the goods through the Middle East. The goods would go from China and from India to the Middle East, and then the Italians would pick them up in the Middle East and then bring them back to Italy, and then from Italy they could go into other parts of Europe. The Italian merchants who facilitated this trade got incredibly rich off of it, and so other countries wanted to get in on that trade as well. The next country that wanted in on that trade was going to be the country of Portugal, which is on the west coast of the Iberian Peninsula right next to Spain. Portugal decided that it couldn't go through the Mediterranean because the Italians were already there. So they needed some other way of traveling to India and to China, but that route was entirely unknown at the time. So they decided to explore. One of the things that allowed Portugal to explore so far, and for other countries to be able to participate in long-distance sea trade, was a new ship called the Caravelle. This Caravelle had multiple decks. It was one of the biggest ships of its time. It had 3 major sails, and you can see on this drawing they had lower decks for cargo, middle decks for sleeping, and then the top deck for the actual work of the ship. It could travel huge distances. It could much farther than others because they had so much more storeroom for goods and for supplies, for food, for water, things like that. So, the Portuguese began their explorations. They decided that they wanted to go around Africa. They had absolutely no idea how big Africa actually was, and Africa is huge. So what they did was they traveled a little ways down Africa, and then they went home. And then they traveled a little farther, and then they went home. And then they traveled a little farther, and they just stayed pretty close to the coast, and eventually Portugal found its way around Africa and into the Indian Ocean. Once they were in the Indian Ocean, they knew that they had easy access to the goods. One of the reasons for that was that the Indian Ocean had an already established, very bustling trade all the way around through the west coast of Africa, through the Middle East, and into India, China, Southeast Asia, etc. So when they came across this bustling trade, they knew that they had hit the Indian Ocean maritime system, they had hit the trade that they wanted, and that they had successfully navigated around Africa. But Portugal was not the only other country that wanted in on this lucrative trade with with South and East Asia, with India and China. Spain also wanted to get in on this, and again, they couldn't go through the Mediterranean because Italy was already doing it, and now they couldn't even go around Africa because Portugal was doing it. So Spain decided to go west across the Atlantic Ocean and see what was there. They were not entirely sure what was there. They didn't know if there was land there, if there wasn't land there, how many islands were out there, what kind of people were out there, if there were people out there. They just weren't sure. But they decided to explore in the same way that the Portuguese were exploring. One of the things the Spanish had going for them was some knowledge that something was out there before they got to Asia. The Vikings, 500 years previously, had actually been to Canada. They had traveled across the north, they crossed Iceland to Greenland to Canada, and had actually set up a colony in what is now Newfoundland in Canada. So there were tales, there were legends of Vikings that had been passed down from generation to generation all the way down to the Spanish. So the Spanish had some idea that something was out there. They didn't know what it was, they didn't know how big it was, but they knew that something was out there. One very important extra thing to know, no one at that time thought the world was flat. No one. They had long established that the world was not flat. There might have been people centuries before who might have thought it was because it looks like ships go down because of the curvature of the earth. But those ships always came back, and they knew from explorations from other long-distance trade and travel that that was not true. You can also, by the way, if you climb to the top of a very tall mountain, you can actually see, or even a very tall building, you can actually see the curvature of the earth from that very spot. So no one at that time believed that the earth was flat. That's actually a myth that is propagated by history teachers and by people who want to think that people back then were stupid and were so much smarter than they are now. So that's it. That's the context of European exploration in the late 15th century, and then the rest of the reading has to do then with the actual exploration as conducted by Columbus and other conquistadors.